the Chase Thomas Podcast, for people who have nothing but time to kill.
Early enrollees now, that I don't even think we need to call them early enrollees. We just need to call them the enrollees, because it's just kind of like, it's more of an issue if you're not an earlier enrollee. It's like you're just kind of behind the eight ball, and it's kind of like you raise an eyebrow if you're not. And obviously there are just some different circumstances involved, but it's kind of like you just see how many kids are coming in December, and for bowl prep or now with college football playoff prep, that's just a different world. And that valuable time in the weight room in the off season, spring workout, see where they're at. I think it's all very interesting how it's just constantly changing. But someone in the last little bit of this last class that I am very, very excited about, and I think Vol fans may overlook this guy. And I know it's kind of easy to say like, oh, this 4-star, 5-star, depending on who you look at now, because On3 gave him a bump to a 5-star. But you guys have him in the top 6 in defensive linemen in the nation in the 25 class. He was a late flip. He was a longtime Clemson guy. You know where I'm going with this, Ryan. I think he's the most important person in this class. And I understand the David Sanders part of it. I understand he's the obvious guy. Their right tackle spot. We'll see if he eventually flips to left, depending on what happens with Lance Hurt. But I think the sky is the limit for this kid. And Tennessee has not had a strong side defensive end with this much upside ever in the Heupel era. Like, I think Tyler Barron's been their best strong side defensive end, and I think they missed him a lot more than I think a lot of folks would admit. And you kind of try to replace him in the aggregate with 3 guys, with Jason Jenkins, Dominic Bailey, and Tyree West, to replace the production of one guy in Barron. I think they kind of got that, but I do think in pass rush stuff and where he was able to do some of the inside work and do a lot of other things, wrecking havoc alongside Pierce, I think Tennessee kind of missed that this year. I think Isaiah Campbell is like that next like super version of Tyler Barron, potentially, of guys who can slide inside on pass rush downs. He's got the frame. I'm just very, very excited because Gardner and this group, they develop better than anyone else on the staff right now. And they haven't had anybody like Campbell with this kind of upside. Am I crazy for saying Campbell could be the number 1 guy when it's all said and done in this class?
I would still lean towards Sanders just because he's got a chance to, if he lives up to his potential, he's got a chance to be a top 10 pick. And those guys are just hard to get. Defensive line's a little trickier because you can be really good and not be a top 10 pick.
Right.
And that's just sort of the nature of that position. I think we'll see. We'll see what happens with Omar Norman Lott. He's risen up some draft boards, but it's hard to crack that first round sometimes. So you could be a really good college player, and it just depends on sort of how they project you, whether you'll be quite at the level that David Sanders could be. And even though Sanders slipped a little bit in our final update, ended up just outside the top 10. He's ranked number 11. He's been one of the top 3 tackles in the class throughout the process. He's just got that potential, especially if he can stay healthy. He had a little bit of trouble with that in high school, had a couple injuries that I think have given our analysts some pause with him. But he has that potential that if you develop him and he develops the way that you think he's capable of, he's got the right head on his shoulders to be that kind of player. If the athleticism and everything pans out the way you think it's going to, I think he's still going to be the player that kind of defines this class. And if he doesn't live up to the hype, that's going to be the big thing. But if he's the player you think he is, he'll still be the star of this group. But yeah, to your point, we haven't seen Josh Heupel have this kind of group on the defensive line, and to me, it's not just Isaiah Campbell; it's Marion Dye. The fact that you've got a guy like Ethan Utley in state, who's kind of a middle of the pack guy, in a lot of classes, he'd be the headliner on Tennessee's defensive line class. He's just the 3rd or 4th guy in this group, which is pretty amazing. So I really like what they got done on the defensive line, and yeah, Isaiah Campbell. That getting that addition on early signing day just kind of took it to another level, and almost fell into their laps. It's crazy that you get a player like that and only have to beat out a North Carolina that had a coaching change right before early signing day to get him. That's just very unusual. And obviously there was more that led up to that. Other teams that tried. He just essentially decided he wanted to pick between Tennessee and North Carolina in the end. So yeah, I think he's got the potential to be that good. At the same time, we've seen some of those guys before. I think back to Kyle Phillips, Shy Tuttle. Tennessee's had some guys ranked in that range, and defensive line can be tricky. So I think he's got a chance to be really good. I just don't know that I'd put expectations on him to the point that, hey, he might be better than David Sanders or might end up being the best player in this class. He could be. We'll see. Sanders looks to me like the safer bet if you were projecting that, but Campbell's got a chance to be really good. And to your point, we'll see where he ends up position-wise too, because he's got a frame, strong side defensive end for sure. I think where you'd put him right now, he might stay there. But he could easily end up a 3-technique defensive tackle too, just depending on how much he develops. So we'll see about that. Could play a little bit of both, like Tyler Barron did. We'll see. But to have a guy with that kind of upside on the defensive line, that's huge, and that was one of the bigger pieces Tennessee obviously added at any point in the class, but certainly down the stretch.
And I think Marion Dye is a good point too, because they've loaded up on Leos. Like, it's just anyone who's like, oh, what's Tennessee going to do without James Pierce? It's like, I think they're going to be fine. They're going to rotate. They're going to be fine. Jordan Ross, still a 5-star coming in. We'll see where he's at this spring and summer. It's a big spring for him. Caleb Herring, still kind of the forgotten one. I mean, he was like another high 4-star, one of the best players in the state of Tennessee in his class. They have a lot of dudes, and Marion Dye was a sneaky big get, number 1 player in the state of Indiana, and pulling him. And I think it's just when you look at that side, I'm just not worried about the Leo side of things. It's just more of, I think what you saw last year is Omar Norman Lott. You really needed him a lot more available. Like, he just didn't get enough snaps for how good he was, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But you saw the difference between 2 years ago, because people, I think, look at the difference between why did Tennessee not get home against Georgia? Why did Tennessee's defensive line not get home? And I think it was because Banks trusted that front 4. Now, 2 years ago, that worked a lot more because Tyler Barron and Omar Norman Lott and James Pierce and other guys were getting home with 4. Like, Tennessee, I think, had better success getting home with 4, but I think a part of that was not because Pierce took a step back this year. It was just because you didn't have that guy on the other side outside of Omar Norman Lott, who was really good on pass rush opportunities too. You just didn't have that guy. Like, Bryson Eason's really good on early downs. Bryson Eason is a different kind of player. Amari Thomas is a different kind of player. You needed someone on that opposite side to kind of just bull rush and help on both sides. And I just don't think it was as even as it could have been. And I think Tyree West showed that. It was in the Oklahoma game. He was really good. He flashed a little bit, if I remember correctly. He was either NC State or Oklahoma. It was early on. Where
the Oklahoma game is where Jason Jenkins showed up big time.
Okay. So it must have been NC State then, maybe, for Tyree West. But he had a good early game, and you're like, oh, maybe this is because he's a good 4-star kid from Tift County down in South Georgia. And he's someone that still, we'll see what he looks like this spring. But Tyree Weathersby was someone that was a big get that Rodney Garner was excited about a couple of years ago. We'll see where he's at coming back from that hip injury. So they have talent there. I just think they really, really need someone to break through. And I really like the idea of Campbell, Marion Dye, and Jordan Ross on opposite sides for the future for Tennessee. And I don't know. They just need more balance. And I think Campbell and West and Tyree Weathersby hopefully can provide more of that balance on the defensive line so that Tennessee can get home a little bit more when they send 4 in these big games. So I don't know. Does that make sense? That's just kind of, that's why I think he's so important to this next 2 to 3 years for Tennessee's defensive line, is they just need to find that balance again.
Yeah. Well, I guess the way I would look at it is this. I think, and Tennessee did try blitzing a good bit. I've heard that a lot about the Georgia game. Against Georgia, they tried blitzing a lot in that game, and it didn't work. They didn't get to Carson Beck. He was torching them when they blitzed. So then they try to go back to just rushing 4, and they don't get there. And that happened too much, to your point, and throughout the season, really, for Tennessee. And I think part of that comes back to what was good about this group on the defensive line. I think it showed up against Ohio State, too. When you're facing elite talent like that across an offensive line like Ohio State had, it was good. Tennessee's had good talent on the defensive line. I think they've largely gotten by on having experienced good players, because experience does matter in college football. Having a 5th-year guy, a 6th-year guy in some cases, that's a big deal. And so I think they've had some good players, but now they've got some guys coming in who have a chance to be at a different level, who have a chance to be more of those top-end guys that you see at Georgia and Alabama and all these places, Texas. So I think that's the difference, is now you've got some higher ceiling players who've got a chance to be early round draft picks. You know, Amari Thomas played a lot of football for Tennessee. He's not going to be picked in the first 2 or 3 rounds. It's just not the type of prospect he is. So that's what I think you're getting now is some of these guys who can give you maybe some additional punch there that have a chance to hold up against the best offensive linemen they'll see. So that's a big deal. And again, Tennessee had not recruited quite at that level on the defensive line for whatever reason. Some battles that went through some guys that slip through their fingers at the end. They've gotten David Hobbs. That's sort of the big exception. They had some nice wins in the transfer portal, like Omar Norman Lott, but it's just not been a consistent thing that they've gone out and gotten big time guys on the defensive line. So we'll see if this year that can be the start of a new trend for them on the defensive line. We'll see if that was sort of a one-off because the D-line was such a priority for them in 2025. But whatever the case, having a group this good, and Jaden Lofton's part of that group as well. I think he's coming off an injury, but from up in New Jersey, I think that was a really nice pickup. So it's a really good group. And Charles House, don't forget about him. I think he's a little bit overlooked in this group. House and Dye, I think, will be defensive tackles. House for sure, but Dye will probably be a 3 technique, and maybe we'll see if he slides back and forth. But I think he'll be a defensive tackle. He's a big kid. So you've got some guys, and we'll see where Ethan Utley fits. He's another one that could be position versatile, kind of like Isaiah Campbell. Could be a strong side end. Could play some D tackle. Could do both. So they've got it's a nice combination of guys that sort of fit in all across the defensive line. Not an obvious Leo in this class. We'll see if Christian Gass ends up being part of the answer there. But either way, you've got some nice depth at that position. It's just starting to look like a much more talent-filled group now, especially maybe next year as a starter. You plug in Jordan Ross and envision him next to some of these young guys that are coming in this year. Then you're talking that's a pretty talented group. So I think that's the big thing, is giving that group a higher ceiling and a chance to really stack up to the Ohio States and the Georgias of the world.
You get me fired up because I feel the same way. Like, if there is a group that I'm most certain of, it's Coach Chop and Gardner and what they're doing there. I just think they're so talented. And if you had to look at this roster and kind of project out in the next 2 to 3 years, what is the most Georgia, Texas portion of this roster? I think it's Tennessee. I think that you look at where they're at and how they're recruiting at that and developing on the defensive line right now, Tennessee. I think that's the one area you just circle and you're like, that if you saw all these exact players on Tennessee or on Texas or Georgia's defensive line, you would look at them and be like, oh, wow. That you wouldn't be like, oh, that's a little bit of it's solid. It's okay. No, it's a really, really great defensive line, a really great core that it's going to be an iron sharpens iron thing where they just have a lot of talent. Doesn't mean they're all going to pan out, but it does mean that you have a lot of options to pan out. And I would bet more on a lot of these guys. And I just think that's what Tennessee's doing the best at right now, is developing defensive linemen. Switching gears here a little bit. I think this is something that I'm not raising the alarm about in terms of where Jamad McCoy is going to be by the time we kick off. We got a long way to go before we figure out where Jamad is going to be in the opener in Atlanta against Syracuse. But what I do find a little bit curious, and I wanted to get your perspective on this, Ryan, is Tennessee doesn't have a true obvious Leo in this 25 class, but they do have a lot of corners, and they have a lot of potential safeties. They have a lot of guys in that room, 2 Milton guys from the powerhouse in Milton, and Tyler Redmond and Dylan Lewis. You have Trey Poteet, who I think last time we talked, you're pretty high on Trey Poteet.
Nicely done, nephew. The Chase Thomas podcast. Hell yeah.